So if you will, on the first page, the front of the first page, you have this statement and it's in bold. Will you please underline these words on it right here? Totally ineffective. Will you please underline totally and ineffective?
By the way, Mr. Beavers, I don't have Amazon Prime.
Okay, I'll have to figure out a alternative for you then. Okay, so if you have looked at Progress Book and you've seen the next test date, you will see that it is about the populists and the progressives. I want to start the progressives in a couple days. We're going to spend at least 2 days on the populists. And when you think of the word populist, technically, what populist means is anybody who is trying to get appeal to the common person. They're not trying to appeal to the upper class. They're not trying to appeal to the wealthy or to the businesses. They're trying to appeal to the underrepresented people of the United States or of any place. In this case specifically, when you think of populists in the late 1800s, I want you to think of the farmers. Now, in addition to that, I want you to think of the Wizard of Oz. This is not something that I'm going to talk a lot about right now, but you might be able to figure it out how this relates to the Wizard of Oz if you have seen it. Now, how many of you have not seen the Wizard of Oz? What? Do you have Disney Plus? If you have Disney Plus, you need to watch it tonight.
Wait, okay.
You know, it's got Hamilton.
Well, yeah, that too. I have
And it's called Disney, so it should have Disney.
that. Yeah.
No, this was like one of the first movies that ever had Technicolor. What?
I only use it for like Marvel.
Fair enough. I mean, that's fair. That's what I use it for mostly too. But and my kids like weird but true. But Wizard of Oz, 1939, it came out. It started like it bookends black and white, beginning and the end, black and white. But in the middle, like Disney is showing off his new Technicolor technology, and so like the middle part, the biggest part of it is color. So let me just give you all who haven't seen it, you poor unfortunate souls, another Disney reference, a summary. Okay, Dorothy is from the state of where? Kansas, and then she gets caught up in a tornado and sent to the land of Oz, O-Z, Oz. Okay, this is a fantasy. Okay, I get. When she gets there, she meets the Good Witch, and then the Wicked Witch of the West. Right, there's also a Wicked Witch of the East, but she gets killed. Right. Yeah, there's a lion. There's a good witch and a bad witch. The good witch gives her what? What color?
Red.
Ruby slippers. They're actually silver in the original book, and that actually is important. She is going to try to get home by following the yellow brick road to get to the Emerald City, where the Wizard of Oz can help her send her home. And that's what she thinks. Along the way, her party gets bigger and bigger and bigger, because at first she meets Scarecrow, then she meets Tin Man, and then she meets Cowardly Lion. When she gets to the Emerald City, she finds out that the wizard is a fraud and really can't help her. And if you want to read find out the rest about how she gets home and all that, no spoilers here. But the point is that this stuff you might see some of that in here. Okay. So now, the thing that I want you to think about mostly during this is what's on the screen. You've underlined, and I had them underlined, Emma, the words totally ineffective in that bold. This is my thesis. This is my argument for you. This is what I'm trying to prove to you today. That's what thesis statement means, is the argument I'm trying to prove. And here it is. The farmers and the populists were totally ineffective. The argument there is totally ineffective in bringing about economic and government reform in the 1880s and 1890s. I want you to refute this. I want you to disprove this. This is a different way of thinking. You're going to have to understand what I'm saying and follow along with me as I'm saying it. But in the back of your mind, I want you to start thinking, well, Mr. Beavers is not telling us, like he's telling us the facts, but he's not interpreting the facts very well. And this is good practice for you because, you're getting misinformation from everywhere at this point in time. They'll give you the facts, but they'll twist it when they interpret it for you. And so I want you to get used to this. Like, for example, there's an entire generation of people who were lied to and told that vaccinations cause autism. So don't get your children vaccinated. Right? And that one person that's popularized that theory was all of his research was shown to be like fabricated. So stay away from misinformation. And during this, I want you to think in the back of your mind, how is Mr. Beavers wrong? How are they not totally ineffective? Okay, got me? The facts are going to be facts, but when I say they were totally ineffective, you should be thinking, well, there's a hole in that logic. Got me? Okay? It's not something I want you to raise your hand like every other second and say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. No, I just, if you want to say it once or twice, that's fine. At the end, we can talk about it more. Will you please flip over in your notes to the next page, and we'll get to the actual notes now. Okay, let me set the stage for you. The stage is, the setting is the late 1870s. We're talking after the Civil War. We're talking in the Great Plains, the flat areas of the United States. We're talking about Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, eastern Colorado, southern South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, those kind of places, right? The farming parts of the country. If you're a football fan, the Big 12 country and part of the Big 10, right? We're talking about people were moving to these areas because they got the Homestead Act to give them free land out west if they just farm it and improve on it, right? And they're flocking to this Central Plains like gangbusters, and their goal is to have their own piece of land, their own wealth created. They're going to be able to wake up in the morning, look at the sunrise over the horizon, and see their own property and crops growing up out of the ground that represents freedom and independence and a way to get ahead in life and wealth, right? And it seems like they are turning the Great Plains, this dry, dusty, tough clay soil, into a breadbasket using the new machinery of this era, of the industrial era. But it seems like every year they feel like they're getting less and less of the profits that they deserve from what they're sowing. Instead of getting ahead in life, they seem to be losing control over their circumstances. And this is their perspective. Now, again, if you're not, how many of you are not geography people? Like, you couldn't point to where you are on a map right now. Okay. Could you point to the Great Plains if I asked you to on a map? You can, Ren? Oh, okay. It's right there because I got to point it, right? Like Nebraska, Colorado, northern Texas, Iowa, Minnesota, Kansas, Oklahoma, right? That's what we're talking about. That's good. So you're using your resources there, right? It's a good idea for you to be able to get to places without having to use your GPS all the time. I'm just saying. Anyway, here is the setup. Here are the problems. Here's where your notes start. In the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, over a generation, it seems like the prices of crops were going down, which is good for people buying the food, bad for people selling the food, like the farmers. They're not getting what they wanted out of their crops. And so a lot of the time, the farmers would mortgage their farms. Now, does anybody know what this word means, mortgage? And notice that T is silent. When is it T silent? Well, it's silent as well. Yeah.
School their house payments, do smaller payments for like how the farmers pay.
That's what we usually think when we think of paying a mortgage, right? Like if you own a house, you pay a mortgage every month, and that helps you pay off your house eventually. That's not what I mean here. In this case, what I mean is they already own their land. They don't owe any money to any bank or anything like that. They own the property free and clear. and they need money.
It's like an Airbnb.
I wish. No, they didn't have that back then. What you do is you go to the bank and you say, I need money. Here's the deed to my farm. If I don't pay you back, you get the farm. You ever play Monopoly and do this in Monopoly? You take the property you own and you have to flip it over and you get the amount of money on the back, and you don't get to get any rent from that until you pay off the loan, pay back the bank, right? And you get to flip it back over. That's what they were doing. They were so desperate for money because they weren't getting money that they were willing to put their house up at risk. And then inevitably, when they couldn't pay off their loans, they would have the banks foreclose on their homes. They would have the banks take their homes from them, right? Yeah, just make sure you write this down. And so they feel like, a lot of them, that the control is slipping out of their hands. And then, of course, you add into it not just the banks as the big business, but the railroads and the grain elevators as big business. The railroads are charging them high prices, like gouging them. Sometimes they're changing the prices at the drop of the hat. They go to the market, to the railroad, expecting to pay $20 for their shipment. They have to pay $30 because the railroad decided to up it that day unexpectedly. And so big businesses from the perspective of these farmers, had too much power. And the grain elevators had too much power. If you don't know, a grain elevator is where the farmers take their grain and they sell it. And then the grain elevator processes it and then sends it on down the market. Are there any grain elevators in Circleville? Yes. Where is a grain elevator in Circleville located? Yeah. Yes, very good. You're the first person today that knew. Maybe one other person might have known. Hardee's across the street, this Cargill, and you might see big semi trucks going in. There's all dusty and everything. That's because they're taking in their wheat and their corn, etc., getting money for it. Then Cargill, does with it what they do with it. That these people were having too much power over their lives, and so it felt like the farmers in the Great Plains it was getting worse and worse for them. Instead of the American dream, where it's supposed to get better and better, it was getting worse and worse for them in the 1870s, 1880s, and even into the 1890s. That's the problem. That's the setup. And so there's this woman named Mary Elizabeth Lease. She is an educated, middle-class farmer, and she is a reformer. And one of her famous quotes, and I don't usually use language like this because I don't swear. This is a swear word she uses. It's not a bad one, but she still uses it anyway. She tells the farmers, quote, "We need to stop raising crops and start raising hell." I don't usually use that language, right? But that's what her point was. We're doing what we're doing all the time, and it's getting worse and worse. So we need to do something to change it, and we need to let people hear our voices so that we can get the change. And so, and look at this. I mean, look at this couple homesteading out here with their thatch roof and the dry, dusty ground, and they're trying to make a living off of this stuff, and they're not getting what they feel like they need to get. And so the farmers took her advice, and they start raising cane. They form alliances, organizations. Think of them almost as like farmers' unions. Some of them were named the Grange, and another one was named the Farmers Alliance. And these groups, they would be groups of farmers, and they would elect representatives and elect leaders of it, and those leaders would go to the state capital of Minnesota, the state capital of Illinois, the state capital of Nebraska, and they would ask for laws to protect their interests. Eventually, they'd go to Washington, D.C. to do the same thing. And these groups were so influential that they still exist today. The Grange is an insurance company for farmers. And the Farmers Alliance may not be around today, but you probably seen those commercials, farmers commercials. It's an insurance company. They have these commercials about like football Saturdays, like, we've insured the craziest things, like the shark fell out of the sky and ripped a hole in our roof kind of thing. Like Sharknado kind of thing, right? We insured that, right? Farmers, da, 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 da. That commercial. Anyway, they're still around, and their goal was to get legislation passed that would protect the farmers. And eventually, when they aren't successful enough, they start forming political parties that'll run candidates that will get elected to state houses and to the House of Representatives. And eventually they try to get a president. They call that party the People's Party. We'll also call it the Populist Party. And the Populist Party represents the farmers. When I say populist from here on out, I don't want you to think of the farmers of the Great Plains of the 1800s. All good? Everybody good so far? Okay, what do these populists, what do these farmers want? They want to reform big business. They want to reform government. Reform is in that next blank right there. Right there. Right there. There you go. Right? They want change. What kind of change do they want, Mr. Beavers? Here's what they want. Obviously, control the power of the big businesses. What? They want income taxes? Were they crazy? They wanted to pay income taxes. You've got to be kidding me. Did you know that before 1913, it was unconstitutional to have income taxes? The federal government could not take money directly out of your paycheck. Did you know that? There was no power in the Constitution given to Congress to do that. Why in the world would they want that? You want to guess? Yeah. Ren.
So that if you keep investing, it will keep paying this tax fraction.
Well, that's a good guess, but do you think that they wanted themselves to be the ones paying the tax? Right. They were poor. They wanted people making $4,000 or more a year to pay income taxes. That back then, think of like 400,000 today, something like that, right? Yeah. Right. You could redistribute the wealth, etc. It really was a way to break the power of the big businesses. It really was. So, who's in government right now? Yeah, you're in government class, so you should know some of the amendments here. We'll get to you. They wanted direct election of U.S. senators. Hopefully you know an amendment there. They want inflation. Now, does your paper say deflation? Will you please cross out D and put in? Mistake on my part. They want to cause inflation, and they want to do that by using bimetallism. Now, I know you don't know what bimetallism is yet, but I can bet you could guess how many metals they're talking about. 2. Bi means 2. Okay, metal means metal. Okay. So my argument is the populists were totally ineffective. Totally ineffective. And I'm going to try to prove that to you now that I've set up everything. Granger laws were passed in the 1870s. Granger laws were, they're named after the Grange. Granger laws said railroads and grain elevators cannot charge too high prices to the farmers and change the rates at the drop of a hat unexpectedly on the farmers. They have to have fair rates for farmers. And these passed, and state governments passed these. This is not a national law. This was a state law, state by state. There were some states that did this out west. And of course, you can imagine that these people right here said, oh, you can't do that to us. And so they hired lawyers to appeal in court. And the Supreme Court ended up taking up the case. And look what the Supreme Court said in Munn versus Illinois in 1876. It is constitutional to regulate railroads and grain elevators. They sided with the farmers. In theory, you should be thinking, Mr. Beavers, your totally ineffective thesis that the farmers were totally ineffective is wrong. But I'm telling you, I'm not wrong, and here's how I know I'm not wrong. Eventually, the Granger laws were overturned. The power of the big businesses was too much, and it got people elected into the state legislatures that would overturn these Granger laws. And then the power of the big businesses was so persuasive that 10 years after Munn versus Illinois, the Supreme Court changed their mind, and overturned Munn versus Illinois with the Wabash case. So I'm arguing the farmers were totally ineffective. Now let's just take a minute right now. Does anybody see a flaw in my totally ineffective thesis statement? I'm saying the farmers did not get anything they wanted. Am I wrong? Yeah? They are amendments. I'll actually address those in just a second. So that's good. I'm glad you're thinking like that. But what about this? Does this prove anything? Can you disprove me using this? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Were they totally ineffective? Yeah. Excellent. 1876 to 1886, the Granger laws were in effect. 10 years. Is that totally ineffective? No, it's just somewhat ineffective. Okay, very good, Michael. Okay, now, if you remember, you might remember the Interstate Commerce Act creating the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the Interstate Commerce Act was a national law. This was a Congress law. This applied to all the states. And here you have Congress and President Grover Cleveland saying, you know what, we're going to support, since the states aren't going to support the farmers after that Supreme Court case, then we will. And so Cleveland signed a law passed by Congress, the Interstate Commerce Act, and it created the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, was an organization run by the government that would regulate trade going across state lines, including railroads. So the ICC is here to save the day. They're going to make sure that the railroads aren't mistreating the farmers. Mr. Beavers, you're wrong. And you know what? I'm not wrong. And here's how I know I'm not wrong. Do you remember when I talked about this the first time I gave you a fraction? And I said, out of 16 cases that went before the Supreme Court challenging the ICC's rulings, how many of those cases were ruled in favor of the farmers? Yeah. 1 out of 16 cases. 15 out of 16 cases ruled in favor of the big business. Now you tell me, how is that effective at all for the farmers? Totally ineffective. Now, look at this. It wasn't until the progressive era, 20 years later, where the ICC actually started to be used for what it was intended to do. Ren, did you want to argue? Is that totally ineffective? What would the fraction be if it was totally ineffective? So there is that. And there's the fact that it was passed in the first place. Okay, now use your brain for the rest of this. We won't go over those specifically. Now, we're switching to direct income taxes. The farmers wanted to tax the rich industrialists and the railroad owners in order to get more, take away some of their power. And there was this law, it was a tariff law. It's called the Wilson-Gorman Tariff. You don't have to remember it. It was passed in 1894. And a little tiny part of that law said, in addition to taxing imports, we're also going to tax people making more than $4,000 a year. It's going to be something like $4 a year right? It wasn't like a big tax or anything. This is the first time the federal government directly taxed people's incomes, not during wartime. And the Supreme Court weighed in on it the next year. And the Supreme Court said in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, income taxes are unconstitutional. The farmers didn't get what they wanted. And you might be like Grant, and you might say, Mr. Beavers, I know what the 16th Amendment did. What did the 16th Amendment do, Grant? It allowed direct taxes of our incomes. Did you know that if you make $10 an hour at McDonald's, you don't really make $10 an hour? The federal government takes like $2, and the state government takes like 50 cents, and the local government takes like 25 cents. Thanks a lot. But it wasn't because of the populists. This wasn't enacted until 1913 because of the progressives, not because of the populists. The populist movement was dead and gone by then for almost 20 years. Populists were totally ineffective. Direct election of U.S. senators. Do you remember this? Here, let's go back. Don't write that down yet. Do you remember this drawing? Do you remember how senators were selected before? You remember this drawing? Little arrow, box, arrow. It's hard to do if you're not on the board, but I had to do this for people who weren't here. Do you remember how senators were selected? Remember who was down here at the bottom? The people. And then we have the senators up top. The people didn't directly elect the senators. Who did? Who chose the senators? Do you remember? The state legislature. Now, I want you to think real quick. This is causing people to go to the U.S. Senate, to Washington, D.C., who don't favor the farmers. So why get rid of this? Why get rid of this middleman? What are the populists hoping to do? Yeah.
Have their direct representation.
Instead of having the big businesses influence the state legislature, we can, and they'll send somebody whose favorite business to the Senate. We'll elect them directly, and they'll favor us. And that's what this is talking about. We want direct election of U.S. senators, so we can get senators who are favorable for reform. Go ahead and fill those in if you didn't fill those in yet. And you might be like Grant and Tim and who else is in government? You know why you're in government this year, right?
I mean, I signed up for it.
One of the reasons why they have sophomores in government is so that you can have a free space next year to take my college credit plus class. Yeah. So you might be like these two and know that the 17th Amendment gives us direct election of U.S. senators. Ha ha, Mr. Beavers, you're wrong. I'm not wrong, because it wasn't the populists that got the 17th Amendment. It was the progressives. It was almost 20 years after the populist movement had died. Populists are totally ineffective. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. We're going to get into inflation and deflation now. And I got a balloon. Inflation and deflation has to do with the amount of money that is in circulation. It has to do with the supply of money. I want you to think, when you think of inflation and deflation, I want you to think about the amount of money that is literal physical dollar bills that are in our pockets and in our wallets and in our pocketbooks and in our purses and in our bank accounts and in the store cash registers and all that kind of stuff. That's the money that's circulating out that we use to buy and sell and get change back and all that kind of stuff, right? What happens when that shrinks? What do we call that situation? Well, what happens when you take a balloon? If you're not watching, the balloon just farted in my face. Okay, what happens when you have a certain amount of air in a balloon and what do you call that?
Deflated.
We deflated the balloon. I want you to think of the air in here as the amount of money in the money supply in circulation. It shrinks, it goes down, right? Now, obviously, the opposite is true. What did I just do to the balloon? I inflated it, and inflation in the money supply is when there's more money in circulation, right? It's when somebody's not hoarding it, the government's not destroying it, the government's printing more of it, or something like that. Now, during this time period, it's not just green dollar bills, it's also gold and silver too. There's gold and silver in the money supply, right? So deflation is the amount of money in circulation decreases. Now, I'm going to explain that just a little bit more in depth here. Deflation is the amount of printed or gold or silver money in circulation decreasing. When you have less of something, that means the value of that thing goes up. So there's an increase in the value of money when there's deflation. And you might think, oh, that's awesome, Mr. Beavers. And you're right. Because you know what happens to prices during deflation? They go down. That's great for us, right? We can go to Kroger and we can get less or more corn for less money. Win-win, right? Except who doesn't like that? The farmers making the corn. They're getting less money than they expected, right? You can buy more at the same dollars, meaning that you can get less money for the same amount that you were expecting. So it's great for consumers. It's not good for farmers. Here's what the farmers want to happen. Here's what the populists want to happen. They want to cause inflation because they were facing at the time deflation. And inflation is the exact opposite of deflation. The amount of money in circulation increases, the value of those dollars decrease. You can't buy as much with the same dollars. This is good for farmers because they're getting more dollar bills in their pocket than they expected to. It's bad for us consumers because we have to pay higher prices, right? The bottom line here is that too much inflation, too much deflation is bad. right? But the farmers in this point of time were facing deflation, and so they went to inflate the economy, inflate the amount of money in supply. In order to do this, oh, by the way, let's just do an example just to make sure that you understand what's going on here, the basics. If I have deflation, what's happening to the amount of money in circulation, up or down? What's happening to the value of that money? You can buy more with less. What happens to the value of money in inflation? What happens to the amount of money in circulation? Going up, and prices go up too. Here's what the populists wanted to have happen in order to offset deflation. They wanted to cause inflation by using bimetallism. You see, back then, you could take $1,000 to the bank or $100 to the bank or maybe even $1 to the bank and say, will you give me back, please, that same amount of money in gold? And they would do it because they had to. Because back then, your dollar bills were backed by gold. They were backed by something physical and valuable that you could hold in your hand. That's different from today, right? What backs our dollar bills today? Pretty much, right? Yeah. It's the amount of confidence we have in our government that backs it. It's worth what we all think the government's worth, basically. Do we trust our government to pay its bills? Do we trust our government to function and run? Do other countries expect our government and trust it to function and run and pay off our bills and our interest on our debt? It also is compared to other currencies around the world, like how much is a dollar worth versus the European euro or the Japanese yen or something like that. It's not really, you can't go to the bank and trade in your money for gold today. There's no gold standard. Back then you could. What the populists want is to take the gold that backs the dollar and add silver. That's going to cause an inflation of the currency. Got me? And that worked for a while. There were silver certificates and gold certificates for a while. But then in 1900, the Gold Standard Act was passed, and it made it so, nope, much less silver is going to back the US dollar. It's going to be primarily the gold standard because gold is better for business because gold is worth more. And the populists fail again. Then we get to the Panic of 1893. We've talked about this a little bit so far, but this hurts the farmers even more. Railroads started going bankrupt because they were overextending their business and their investments. And when railroads go bankrupt, they don't build more track. And when that happens, the steel industries don't get as much business, and so they have to lay off workers. And so people started panicking. That's why it's called a Panic of 1893. And they started realizing, oh my goodness, my dollar bills may not be worth very much. And so they went to the banks and they asked for gold, and gold reserves fell because people were trading in their dollar bills for gold. And so the federal government was facing a gold shortage. There was deflation, if you will. The only thing that saved the country was J.P. Morgan giving a gold loan to the U.S. government. Unemployment rose to 20%. This is the second worst economic depression we ever had in our history. The only worst one was the Great Depression. And of course, farmers at the bottom, and so they're suffering the most during this time. In this context, enter a man named Jacob Coxey. Jacob Coxey was a populist reformer. He's from Ohio. And Coxey's populist idea was to print more money to cause inflation, not silver in this case, but just print more greenbacks. And then use that money to hire people to build parks and to build roads and bridges and that kind of stuff, and the things that we expect the government to do today when there's economic crisis, right? He was one of the first people, as populist, to say the government needs to step in. The federal government needs to step in and help us out and help us get jobs. And we just expect that today. And you'll see that nobody listened to him. He thought that this would help lower unemployment and offset deflation. And so nobody in Ohio listened to him. So Coxey goes on a march from Massillon, Ohio to Washington, D.C. If you were to drive from Massillon, Ohio to Washington, D.C. at 70 miles an hour average, it would take you 9 hours. It takes me 6 hours to drive to see my sister who's in the Secret Service. Did I tell you I have a sister in the Secret Service? Of course I did, because I'm very proud of her. Imagine how long it would take you to walk there. And it's a publicity stunt. He's going to march to Washington, D.C. He starts with 100 people, and by the time he gets there, his party has grown to 500 people. And he's thinking that he's going to get to Washington, D.C., and that President Grover Cleveland is going to help because President Grover Cleveland cares about the common person. And he gets there, and he's arrested for trespassing on the White House lawn. The person who expects to help him fails him, and another populist, another one bites the dust. To quote Queen, nobody listened to him. So the populists have one last ditch effort to try to get some kind of victory. They are able to get a Democrat running for president to side with them. His name is William Jennings Bryan. He's the first major party candidate in the past 30 years to say, I agree with the farmers and the populists. His name is William Jennings Bryan. He's from Nebraska. When he speaks, it's like he's got a lion's roar. Like people just listen to him because he's such a great speaker. He was called the boy orator of the Platte. Platte is a flat land, right? He's from Nebraska. He's a populist defender. And he gets the Democratic National Convention's nomination. Running against pro-business Ohio Governor and Senator William McKinley. McKinley is pro-business. He's for the gold standard. He doesn't want bimetallism. And in fact, there are Democrats who don't want silver either. There are Democrats who want gold. They're called gold Democrats. And so William Jennings Bryan isn't expected to even be the nominee. And he gets up in front of the Democratic National Convention in the summer of 1896, and he makes this speech. And it absolutely enthralls the crowd. They stand up to their feet and cheer because he looks at the gold Democrats in the audience and he says, you all suck. He didn't say suck. He was throwing shade at the gold Democrats. He was looking at them and saying, you are on purpose trying to hurt the farmers because what you want is gold and not silver. You don't want inflation. You don't want to do the things that's going to take to help the farmers out. It's like you are the Romans who crucified Jesus on the cross. It's like you are crucifying the farmers to a cross of gold. And he gets a Democratic nomination, and guess who wins? Not the guy who represents the farmers. The guy who represents the businesses. Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie put money into McKinley's coffers, and a lot of businessmen tell their factory workers, because the factory workers have joined the populists at this point, if you go to work tomorrow, or you might as well not come to work tomorrow if Bryan is elected. Because we're just going to have to fire you. Because William Jennings Bryan is going to close us all down. And so the workers don't vote for who they wanted to vote for. Please bring that tomorrow. Because I want to talk to you more about that. Have a good day. Thank you for listening. Yada, yada.
Pretty good person. Bro, my defense is